Hey guys, this is Kendall Terry, and this is a look at the urinary system, looking primarily at the removal of water, salts, and metabolic waste, or the reabsorption of those, depending on what needs to happen, at least of water and salts. Metabolic waste, obviously, we're trying to get rid of. So let's go ahead and jump on in then what we're looking at. There we go. First thing is looking at this is the evolution of the kidney. There's a couple of steps along the way to get to what we would call the mammalian kidney. We're going to look at 4 of those today. The first is looking at flatworms. Now, we could go below this level, but below this level, a lot of times you just have the excretion into the environment. In this case, we're actually looking at a system that it's having to use some type of structure to remove metabolic waste from the body and then get that metabolic waste out. And this is the flatworm, and it uses what we call protonephridia that branch throughout the body like into bulb-like flame cells. And you can see those here, and this little cilia here that hang down, those are what actually do the absorbing of the fluid. And as they absorb that fluid, then they dump that fluid into these collecting tubules, and then those collecting tubules will empty out through the excretory pores located all throughout the bottom of this organism. So you end up then with this kind of filtration, if you will, of the fluids in the system, the fluids in the body, that need to get rid of that metabolic waste. And this is primarily what this is looking at. These organisms are primarily growing in moist environments. That's what we're looking at with flatworms. They need that moist environment. So they're not necessarily concerned with water loss from the body because they've got this water around them that they can absorb, but they're needing to filter out that metabolic waste. Then you go to the next one, which we would consider to be the annelids, or the roundworms, and now you see a true nephridia. So before we call that protonephridia because that's really before the true nephron, and now you have the nephridia. Now this obtains fluid from the body cavity through a process of filtration into funnel-shaped structures called nephrostomes. And you can see here is the nephridium. Okay, it's labeled on here. Let's see, I think I can go a little bit closer. So here's the nephrostome, and you can see the kind of funnel type. As fluid comes in, it's going to be filtered through and then sent through this complex capillary network. And as it goes through that, it's going to be absorbing some things and letting out other things as it goes. And then eventually there'll be a liquid that's collected in the nephridium, and through the nephridium pore down here, you'll have urine excretion. Next would be the Malpighian tubules of the insect. Now this is an interesting adaptation here because these are Malpighian tubules are extensions of the digestive tract. So they're connected to that digestive tract, and they surround these body systems. Now, if you'll remember, insects have an open circulatory system. So these tubes are kind of in these open system areas. And they work not by filtration, as some of the others have, but through secretion. So what happens is you get, let me zoom in on this a little bit, you get potassium actively transported into the Malpighian tubules. And then that will cause water through osmosis to also be secreted into these vessels. So that gives the liquid then that needs to be in there. And then you get the waste is actively transported into these tubules as well. So you've got a mix now of waste with water, and that will help flush these wastes out of the Malpighian tubules into the digestive tract of the insect. And then water will be reabsorbed in ions in the hindgut right before the liquid leaves the anus. So they're going to do a reabsorption of water at the very end, but they work through secretion, not filtration, which is what the others are working with. The last one is the kidney of the vertebrates. The kidneys of the vertebrates create a tubular fluid by filtering the blood under pressure, and we're going to look more in depth at this a little bit later, so I'm not going to talk much about it right now. But this would be the last of the development. You've got a fully developed kidney now with fully developed nephrons, and we'll go into more detail with this. So now let's look at the evolution of the kidney. When we look at vertebrates, There's a process along the way to get to the mammalians that we see today in that kidney. The first would be looking at the freshwater fish. In the freshwater fish, there's two serious problems. You're surrounded by water, so that's not a huge problem, but the water tends to enter the body from the environment. So you end up then with your cells really becoming swollen with water, and this could be a negative thing. Animal cells don't have a cell wall, and you could end up a bursting of those animal cells unless you have some way of getting water out. The other are solutes tend to leave the body and enter the environment. So now you're losing important things like sodium and potassium and chlorine, things that the body needs to function. So let's look a little bit more in depth at that. So here's the freshwater fish. So it will take in food through the mouth. Of course, water will also come in through the mouth to go through the gills, but it stops the flow of water into the intestinal tract. They don't drink a lot of water because they already have enough water being absorbed into their cells, so they don't need to consume amounts of water. They're going to get water in other ways. So in the gills, right here where that oxygen is being transferred in the blood, you'll also have active absorption of sodium and chlorine, and water enters through osmosis as well into the blood system. So now you've got water in the blood system. You've got to get that out. Well, here you've got the large glomerulus that is helping filter out, pulling water and sodium out of the blood into the kidney tubules, okay, if you will, the nephrons. And then in the nephrons, it will, through active reabsorption, take sodium and chlorine back out, because remember, one of the problems with these guys is, you can see number 2, they tend to lose solutes into their environment. So here's a system of reabsorbing some of those solutes back into the cells as that liquid is going through the tubular kidney. And then what's left in there is urine, and this will be a very dilute urine. They push a lot of water out because they don't need that water. So they push water out through the urine, and it becomes a very dilute urine mixed with urea that helps get rid of some of that extra water of the cells. The next, we're going the wrong direction. Here we go. All right. Next is marine fish. Now, when you look at marine fish, you've got a little bit different setup now, because now those cells are no longer losing massive amounts of, or absorbing massive amounts of water. They're losing massive amounts of water to their environment, because that saltwater environment draws water out of animal cells. So they will now consume a lot of water. So they do so through the mouth. A lot of these marine animals will actually swim with their mouth open, and it's pulling in water. Of course, water has to pass over the gills, but water is also passing into the digestive tract. And in the digestive tract, you will get passive reabsorption of water as well as sodium and chlorine, salt. Of course, the water they're bringing in is salt water, so they're also going to absorb that salt. In their gills, you have active secretion of sodium, chlorine, and water loss. So here's an area that they're losing water from their blood into the saltwater environment. So you get water being absorbed in the kidneys, or in the stomach of their intestinal tract. Now what they're going to do is they're going to lose magnesium and a sulfate here. These are divalent ions, are going to be voided with feces, and that's a way to get rid of those metabolic waste that you don't need. And what they're going to do here is also in their tubular kidney, they're going to secrete magnesium and sulfate ions into their tubular kidney structures, and this is helping to get rid of those so that you can absorb the sodium and chlorine ions that you need. And then the kidney will excrete excretion of urine or urea with a small amount of water, because when you're secreting these divalent ions into the kidney, that will help put water out of those kidney areas back into the cells, because we want to keep that water. So it's a way to keep the osmolarity going into the cells and not into what's getting ready to leave. So you lose less water with magnesium and then the sulfate ions as well. Then we have the mammalian in birds. Now these produce urine with a higher osmotic concentration than their body fluids. The others, they were secreting urine that was pretty close to their body fluids. Now you're seeing a very concentrated urea. So we're taking a lot of water out of that urine and saving that water for us, our body cells, and getting rid of the metabolic waste, the urea. So where hypotonic urine is developed because of the loop of Henle portion of the nephron. And we can zoom in. We're going to look a little bit more in depth at this in just a second. So here's our kidney structure. And in the kidney you have the medulla and the cortex. And in the cortex and medulla you have this loop of Henle. Here's the nephron, the glomerulus. Here's the loop of Henle. And this loop of Henle helps to reabsorb water so that by the time the liquid gets to here, that's very little water left in it. And you can see these little loops, but then you can see the development of these huge loops of Henle. And these huge loops really help us reabsorb the water that we need so that that urea is high concentration of urea, low concentration of water, and thus saving water loss from happening in mammals. Remember, when you're talking about the evolution of land animals, they're no longer in water environments. So water does not always come easily to these organisms. So they have to have a way of reabsorbing the water that's in their system so that they're not losing it all through the urine. So they produce urine with a higher osmotic concentration than their body fluids. Urine is developed because of the loop of Henle. So let's look at that. So when we look at the loop of Henle, this loop creates a gradient of increasing osmolarity from the cortex to the medulla. So when you look at the passage of this and you get this long loop of Henle, and you can see this takes place right here from the cortex to the medulla, as that goes into the medulla, that's where you're going to see that increasing osmolarity, which helps water go back into the body cells, back into the blood supply where it's needed and important. You don't want to just lose that water. All right? So now the last thing I want to look at is regulation. There's two hormones that we're going to talk about. First is ADH. ADH is a negative feedback loop that helps maintain correct blood osmolarity. So let's say you start to lose water from the blood. In other words, you start to dehydrate. Well, what happens is it stimulates the hypothalamus to produce ADH. ADH causes the distal tube, the part coming up from the loop of Henle, to increase permeability and increase water coming reabsorption. So you got water reabsorption helps to prevent further osmolarity increases, and it brings that homeostasis of the blood osmolarity back to where it's supposed to be. That also, up in the brain, will trigger you to be thirsty. You'll drink more water. As you drink water, you reduce blood osmolarity to its set point as well. So there's two functions going on there. One, as the blood osmolarity is lower than what it should be, in other words, you've got dehydration taking place, you'll have the secretion of ADH, which will cause more water to be absorbed from the kidneys, and you'll have that thirst take place in your mouth. So now you're thirsty, you want to drink liquids, and as you drink liquids, you're balancing out that blood osmolarity as well. The other one that I want you to see is aldosterone and the atrial atriuretic. Sorry, that's a weird one to say. But here we've got, this is called renin angiotensin aldosterone, and it's a negative feedback as well that helps keep homeostasis of blood volume. So blood volume is kind of like blood pressure, and as that decreases, it causes, this right here is called the juxtaglomerular apparatus. It's right before the glomerulus, and as the blood pressure decreases going in there, it will cause the release of renin. Renin will cause the production in the body of angiotensinogen, which will cause angiotensin II. Okay, angiotensin II will cause the adrenal glands, which is located right above the kidney, to secrete aldosterone. Aldosterone increases sodium and water reabsorption in the distal tubes, and that increases the blood pressure and blood volume, brings it back to homeostasis. So the stimulus there, blood volume is too low. The juxtaglomerular apparatus, the JGA, will release renin, and then that renin will cause the reactions to take place to increase sodium and water reabsorption in the distal tubes of the nephron. So you get also a negative feedback loop. So you get something going on here that's lower than it should be, will increase it with a series of reactions to bring it all back into focus. So both of these are hormones that are released in the blood supply that help keep the blood concentration the volume it should be. The flip side of that is the atrial natriuretic, and I don't have that one on here, but this is from the atrium of the heart. If blood pressure increases, the atrium starts to stretch, so it will release atrial natriuretic, which will cause water to be reabsorbed back into the nephron, and that decreases the volume of the blood and thus decreasing the blood pressure. So both of those kind of help keep that homeostasis of just the right blood pressure in those arteries and veins.